Hey, welcome back to the Kaleido Roasters USA YouTube channel. This is part of Espresso Outlet, and I wanted to do a video that's going to just be specifically on Artisan today. So we're planning to do an upcoming roasting series on what does a good roast look like using Artisan for your actual roasting process. But if you don't understand some of the stuff that is on the Artisan display, it's going to make the remainder of these videos a lot more confusing. So I feel like this is going to be a really good way to start out if you're just starting out using Artisan. Maybe you've even been using Artisan for a while and you're still kind of scratching your head as to what some of these things mean. So I felt like this would be a great video and a great opportunity to do so. So we're just going to dive right in. We're just going to start picking apart this main display on the Artisan app. So in this case, I'm using Artisan 2.10.0, more or less. They're all the same user interface from what I've seen. I believe they just came out with Artisan 3. It's really new, so I'm not even really going to look at it for a little while. But let's get going. Let's start with the axes. You'll notice off to the left, we have our first y-axis. This is degrees in temperature Celsius. So this is going to be just as we're tracking the progress of the roast, this will be in degrees Celsius. I will note that you can convert this to degrees Fahrenheit if you choose. Most roasters, at least from my experience, use degrees Celsius, and if you share a graph with someone else and they've done it in Celsius and you're trying to convert it to Fahrenheit, it's going to be a little bit more confusing. Also, just as I'm noting this, if you do try to load a background that's in Celsius, but you're running it on Fahrenheit, Artisan is not going to really understand or do any of the conversions for you. So if you have a Fahrenheit background, run it in Fahrenheit. If you have a Celsius background, run it in Celsius. We'll go over that a little bit more later. The next thing, we have our timeline at the bottom. This is pretty simple. It just starts at 0 minutes. And in this case, it shows it ends at 10 minutes. If you were to say, let's go 15 minutes on a roast, it will just keep adding to the timeline and shifting this graph down. So pretty straightforward on how this graph works in terms of time. The next is your second y-axis. It's off to the right side, and you'll see it goes from 0 to 25. And this is degrees Celsius, or if you have it in Fahrenheit, degrees Fahrenheit per minute. What does this mean? Well, this is your rate of rise. Sometimes you'll see it ROR, and in the case of Artisan, you're going to see delta BT. Delta is the change in bean temperature, so that would be your rate of rise. So you can kind of, let's just take like 15, we'll go over, and at this point it was 15 ROR, at this point it was 15 ROR, so that is what that right y-axis means. The next thing, that it took me a minute because you just kind of have a lot going on the screen. But if you notice, it goes gray, white, all the way up to this top portion. There's really no numerical values given to these, but this is in percentage. This is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And what does these individual lines correlate to? Well, it is actually the feedback for specific items within your roaster. So for example, you can see this blue down here is our air. So this would be our smoke air going out of the back of the roaster. And you can see I ran this roast at 20% the entire roast. Similarly, we have our burner right here. It's kind of this brown red color, and you can see how I made all these different burner changes throughout the roast. So if you're going to re-roast these beans, like for example, I'm not very happy with this area right here. I'm going to make changes to my burner power percentage in the future. So it's really good feedback, and these are items that you will need if you're going to record this roast and then replay it back as a quote-unquote auto roast. So we'll go over that, totally different video. We're trying to hit just kind of the features of Artisan today. So we do have a couple of lines on the graph. What are each of these lines? Luckily, they have it color-coded for us. So the first one at the top is our ET. In the case of Kaleido, it's an environmental temperature. Sometimes it's interchangeably used with exhaust temperature. There are manufacturers of roasters, they have the temperature probe in the exhaust. Kaleido is not one of those. It is a true environmental temp. So that is, what is the temperature inside that roast chamber outside of the drum? It's kind of like, what's the temperature in your oven? Next, we have this red color, and this is your bean temperature. So there's a second temperature probe on the front of your roaster that is immersed inside your beans. So when you put those green beans in, it's going to be fairly cold, and as the roast progresses, you can see the bean temperature rises and rises and rises, and that is our bean temperature. We've already kind of gone over the delta BT. It is this kind of squiggly line all over the place. That is fairly normal. What we're really looking for is this is more or less the trend line. It's going up, and then it goes down at an angle, and then it goes down at a more sharp angle. And that's kind of how we desire to roast. We're not going into that today, but a little bit of that noise isn't a big deal. Some people, they try to smooth the noise out. You can turn on different filters. You can turn on different sample rates. We do not recommend doing that because the settings that are set up for Kaleido are specific for the control board. I've seen people try to increase and decrease the sample rates, and it causes all sorts of issues. So I recommend just leaving it stock, leaving it alone. As we're talking about the rate of rise, this is just more of a textbook type thing. Typically, it is measured in 1 minute intervals. So, for example, if the delta BT or the rate of rise is 10, you see a 10 right here, that means that it is going to increase by 10 degrees Celsius every minute. So that's really good when we're trying to plan out our entire roast, when we start developing a roasting plan for a new bean. Where do we need to be at what point in the roast to reach our end desired drop temperature? So that's a completely different lesson in itself, but it is one of the most valuable things that I'm looking at. Is my roast does it have too much momentum, or does it not have enough momentum? And that's a really good feedback indicator for me. Next, we have this value over here. It is called the SV, and this really throws people off. SV stands for set value, and I use it for really two main things. The first value would be our charge temperature. So what is the charge temperature? It is the temperature that you're going to preheat your roaster to get it going. You don't want it running as hot as it can go. It's going to be too hot. You need to have some sort of a starting point where when you introduce the green beans at the start point, your green temperature is actually down here. So this is a little bit confusing in the way of your beans are not 170 degrees when you drop them. They're actually more like 57 degrees. And there's an imaginary line that goes through here that you can't see. But we want it so that this turning point is generally 45 seconds to a minute. So what is that equilibrium point where the roaster and the green coffee are at that same equilibrium point? That's going to be our turning point. Adjusting the set value for the charge temperature, it will move this turning point backwards or forwards, and it'll really dictate the momentum and how that roast is going to progress. So again, that's a completely different lesson, but that's the first thing that I use my set value for, is the charge temperature. And it's not going to be just completely as hot as this roaster can go. The next thing is, once we charge, we're not wanting to drop those coffee beans at 170 degrees. You can see in this example, I dropped at 201.2. Well, if we don't up this set value to over 200, it's going to hit 170, and it's going to stall that roast. It's going to ruin your beans. So it's very important that once you start the roast, you might set it up to 205, 210. I regularly just set mine max because I don't want it to prematurely end. Maybe I want 1 extra degree than what I'm thinking in my head, and I'm looking in the trier. So make sure after you charge your machine to set that set value to at least what your drop temperature is anticipated to be, if not higher. It's not going to hurt anything if you go higher, but note you will have to manually end the roast. So where does this confuse people? Well, you have a set value, which is a temperature, and you also have a burner percentage. So the best way that I can explain this to people is you have a thermostat on your house. You set your heater to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it gets down to 69, it turns your heater on. And when it gets to 71, it turns your heater off. That's more or less what the set value is doing, is it's trying to maintain whatever temperature you have put in here. It'll at least be that hot or hotter. Now your burner percentage is going to be how quickly does that heater in your home heat up your house. Maybe you have a dual stage heater, and the first stage is really aggressive and it heats your house up very quickly, and then it has a lower stage heater to just kind of top off the heat. You don't have to run the full heat. It's kind of like turning down the power level on the roaster, so it's not going to react as quickly. I hope this makes sense, but it does confuse a lot of people, so I wanted to spend a little extra time on it. We do have the air, and the air refers to your exhaust air, so that's the air going out of the back of your roaster. Typically it has some smoke in it. It also just keeps air moving through the roaster for the convection process. You have your drum speed, and these are all sliders off to the side. And you'll notice that most of these sliders are also represented with buttons along the bottom. So if you don't want to move these sliders up and down, you can do a quick change by just clicking a button, and you can see that it sets the slider to 80. So very handy having those buttons. They're pretty much interchangeable. As we go through these buttons, you have the burner up and down. Maybe you're just wanting to do 5% increments. You're not wanting to figure out, okay, where I'm at. I'm at 50. Okay, I want 55. You can just click up, down. This is just plus minus. Same thing with the air. When you begin a roast, you'll have a charge temperature, and you will set your burner to a specific percentage. I usually do 100. It's not going to begin roasting until you click the start heating button. So this is kind of the on-off button for the roaster's heating elements. You will want to make sure that you have your air running and your drum running prior to clicking the start heating button. We also have these two additional buttons. One is for auto burner and manual burner. So the auto burner, if you have a background loaded, we'll cover that in a minute. If you have a background loaded, it's going to automatically follow a previously recorded temperature profile. Now, it's not going to be perfect if you're using a different coffee bean. It's not going to be perfect if it's recorded in the summertime and it's -10 outside. It's not going to be perfect if your last batch was 200 grams and this one is 400 grams. So this is just one of those things when people do an auto roast. No, it's going to try to make adjustments the best it can, but it can only do so much. So just make sure that you are watching your roast if you're trying to do a recorded roast and using this auto burner feature. If for whatever reason your cooling fans in the front don't turn on, or you're wanting to turn them on again just for cooling down your beans a little extra time, you have this on-off button for the cooling fans in the front. So that's more or less the user interface in the Artisan app. A couple different things on this graph that might not stand out right away, but this first portion at the bottom, even though it goes gray, white, gray, white, gray, white, depending on which background setup you have, you can change your colors and everything in this software, but this is how mine is set up on the Classic. This bottom portion right here, this bottom white barrier, is your drying phase. So you have 3 different phases in roasting. You have your drying phase, you have your yellowing and Maillard phase, and then you have a development phase. So this bottom portion right here is your drying phase. You'll see there is a small gray bar through the middle, and this is going to be your yellowing or Maillard phase. So this is going to be where all your complex carbohydrates are caramelizing, and you're getting the acidity and you're getting the sweetness into your coffee. It's a very important phase. It's one that is going to really make or break your roast. And then lastly, above this gray area right here, it's typically about the same time as first crack, but not always. Sometimes first crack is a little bit after. This upper phase is your development phase. So that's more or less how dark the outside of your coffee bean is. You want this nice even roast all the way through. You don't want it baked. If you're baking it, you're going to be baking all of those chemicals out of the coffee, or the molecular compounds out of the coffee, and you're not going to have a tasty coffee. But we also don't want it to be really light all the time, and we don't always want it to be really dark all the time. So the last phase is this development phase. So now we're going to go over to a recording of the previous background that I had loaded, and this recording is going to show us a few things that weren't on that original screen. As soon as we click the on button and the start button at the top of the screen, you'll see an additional layer of buttons show up. And the first button that you're going to see is charge, and it's very important to go through all of these buttons. If you're not using these buttons, the software is not going to track how your roast is progressing. It might show a little bit on the screen, but all the calculations and all the really useful feedback is not going to come. So when we introduce the green beans in, it's important to click the charge button. When we click the charge button, it's going to start trending the graph. You'll see all the lines start to move across that timeline. So it's going to start tracking time. Once we reach that turning point, you'll notice that the dry percent and the anticipated end dry time at the top will start to give you some feedback. So what's really nice about this is with the dry time, it's going to tell you, yeah, you're really pretty much on track to dry your beans in about 5 minutes. And maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you're wanting to do a quicker roast and you're wanting 4 minutes. So that tells you you need to increase your temperature. Similarly, you could have it where it says dry time is 8 or 9 minutes out, and you're going to have to tell yourself, I need to up this temperature to get this dry time down to 4 to 5 minutes, depending on how your roast plan is set up. As soon as we click the dry end, there is no magic for when the actual dry end is. That's a completely different topic and video. But when you click the dry end button, the next thing that it's going to start calculating is the time to first crack. So it's going to, again, give you feedback of, we think first crack is 6 minutes or 8 minutes or 10 minutes. And depending on that feedback, you're going to want to increase or decrease your burner and get that to the desired approximate first crack time so that you can have the correct development phase. So very useful calculators that are built into the top of your Artisan app. If you do have a first crack and you're wanting to go to second crack, you can also click the first crack end as well as second crack start and second crack end. So the second crack is going to be fairly dark coffee beans, but it is in the app and you can have those show up on your graph so that you can trend this in the future. At the very end, when you reach that desired bean temperature and the color that you're looking for, you will end the roast clicking the drop button. If you don't click the drop button, it's going to keep progressing on the graph. Open the dump chute and all the beans will come out into your cooling tray. It is built in, at least for Kaleido, to turn on your cooling fan, so it's fairly automated and it's a pretty nice user experience. So now that we've completed this roast and we are going to save this profile, I recommend everyone saving their profiles at the end. You can go up to the file. I believe you have to have it in the off position. You go up to the file and either save or save as. So we can do a save as. I like to give the date, in this case, the coffee that I roasted, how many grams, and what the charge temperature is. And this, you will enter all this into the software, but it's always really nice when you're just flipping through files. You don't have to open up every single file. You can just read it in the file name. You don't have to name yours this way, but it's been extremely helpful for me. So we'll click save, and this will save this graph for a future use. Similarly, just to look really quickly, I like to do this save graph as JPEG, and I'll go down and find the roast that I just did, and I'll click on it, but it's going to just save it as the exact same name as a JPEG. Really nice to share. You can share it with a friend if you have questions, if you're looking for roasting feedback, putting it on Facebook, whatever you're wanting to do. It makes it really handy to not have to open up Artisan to look at that graph. So now that we have this graph saved somewhere, let's say that we want to play this back. This is going to be one thing that a lot of people will want to do. You can either do an auto roast, but it's also kind of nice just to have it as a roast background. If you're doing the same bean repetitively, even if you're wanting to take manual control over it. So we can go up to the roast menu in background. And you'll see at the bottom there is a path. When we click load, we can go find that background and click open. It's already been loaded, so nothing is going to change. That's how you would load a background. When we're doing an automated roast, or if you're wanting to do a manual roast, but you just want to have the background, and you're like, why is this thing taking control of my roast? I want to take control of the roast myself. This is something that it does frustrate a lot of people, but it's very easy to remedy. Another button is this control button, and this is where we're going to head, and you can see that there's a set value menu right here. And when we do the drop down menu, I have mine set to manual because I like to have manual control over the roast. If we set it to background, it's going to try to adjust that set value to whatever this value is on the background, and it's going to try to adjust the burner accordingly. If you would like, you can always have your set value on manual, and you can have your charge temperature set much higher, and then you can click the start PID on charge. And what this will do is you can have your charge temperature higher, but when you drop that charge temperature down to where you're actually wanting to start, maybe you're just preheating your roaster, when you click the charge button, it's going to start that PID controller to control the roast automatically for you. If you're still having some issues turning it off, you can always click this off button, and that will bypass and turn off the PID controller. So a very useful menu. When I start setting up a roast profile and I start doing my pre-roast plan, we'll do an entire video on this, but just to show you where it is, we go up to the roast and properties button, and we will want to enter the name of the coffee. As well as the weight that we're planning to roast it to. Now, I don't have the exact value in front of me, but let's say the output weight is 345 grams. When we click off to the side, it will automatically calculate the weight loss of the beans for us. So not like you can't throw that in a calculator, but it will save this in the graph, and it's very useful. I also like to measure bean density. That's something that, again, another one of those different videos. Different density of beans and sizes of beans, they're going to roast very differently. So having a good understanding of the bean density, I like to keep track of it here. If you have any additional notes that you would like, you can have roasting notes like, oh geez, it went way too fast. Next time, drop your charge temperature. You can add all these types of notes here. Or, oh, I forgot to set my set value up, but I saved the roast, so this isn't exactly the best roast profile, but something to keep in mind for the future. You can add any of those notes there. As you're cupping your coffee, you can add all your cupping notes here, and maybe you want to put in that, hey, it needs another 3 degrees Celsius, and that's going to really change this. Very nice to have all of this information in one place on the roast. So I know we've gone a little bit long, but we're going to go just through a few of the menu items that I find really useful. And as we do some of these upcoming series, it's going to be good just to know where some of these things are. The main two menus that I use are the roast as well as the config. So the config is going to have all of your machines. In this case, we're looking at the Kaleido roasters. So it has Kaleido here at the bottom, and that's going to be to set up your machine. We already have a video on that, so we're not going to cover that. If for whatever reason your communication port is set to the wrong COM port, you can always check it underneath this port menu, and it's pretty easy to get to. The next one, I get this question a lot. People want to know, how can I get my custom logo on the back screen? And it's really easy. It's underneath this curves menu under the UI tab. And then we can go load. Let's load something different. We can load a new picture, and when we click OK, it will update the background picture. So that's really the main thing that I use underneath curves. It's kind of fun, especially if you're sharing your graph. It looks cool. So that's where you get to that. The next is your event menu. It's going to pop up on the config tab. There's not a whole lot that you need to do here. Once you run your Kaleido configuration, it's going to fill all this in for you. The only reason I note this is on some of the older machines, the way Artisan's set up, there's actually different I/O outputs. And on the cooling fans, some people have issues with the cooling fans not turning on. It's a very easy fix. You'll just find the cooling fan function and you'll make a few changes. If you have any questions on that, it's on our website. But to get to that, it's underneath the events and the buttons tab. Next, we're not going to go into this much, but something that's nice to set up is an alarm. So for example, on the previous version of Artisan, once I click charge, I actually added an alarm that's like, hey, reminder, set your set value higher so that you don't stall your roast later. I usually remember, but there is a time where you're just having one of those days and then you forget to set up that set value and your roast is about to be ruined. So you can add all sorts of alarms in this tab, and it can go very detailed. So it's a more advanced feature. Just know that it's there. A little bit of information on the Artisan website might help you out. Earlier we discussed the phases. So you have your drying phase, your Maillard phase, and your development phase. These are all set to the factory default. You can now also restore to default here if you need to. Maybe whatever climate you're in, you want to just change this by a few degrees. So this is where you can change it. You can also change it time, percentage, or temperature. I just leave mine as percentages. Next, you'll see some people have different color buttons. They're like, why are their buttons a different color? Well, you can actually go in and there's all these different theme setups that you can go in and you can just choose a different theme. It really doesn't change anything on the program, but it does give this completely different output. So if this is something that is more appealing to you, I feel like the blue is a little bit difficult for me to read, but this is something that you can change. Similarly, the colors tab, if you don't want your ET to be red, you can change your ET to whatever color you want. That's just an example. To change the temperature, you'll need to make sure that it is not in the on position. It's not going to change temperature if the roaster is connected. But you can see we can change it to Fahrenheit, and it's going to say Fahrenheit per minute. It's really easy to flip back and forth. I just want to give that quick reminder, if you have a background in Celsius, it's not going to really convert it to degrees Fahrenheit, at least with the existing version of Artisan. So that is pretty much all for today on really getting going with Artisan. I feel like if you don't understand what some of these terms mean, it's going to be very confusing moving forward. What's ET? What's BT? What's delta BT? I hear ROR. All those things. I mean, a lot of these terms get used very interchangeably, and it adds to a lot of confusion. Also, just knowing where all these different menus are, they're all there, but sometimes you kind of have to think, where is it? I'm not exactly sure where this exact menu is. Just a quick refresher through this video, you can skip through, and you can find where some of those things are. Again, Artisan, they do have some write-ups on their website, but you have to go out there, you kind of have to know what you're looking for and find it. So if you have any further questions, you can feel free to drop a comment below on this video. We are planning to do a roasting series, so you're getting started with roasting, and what's a good roast look like? What's a good charge temperature look like? What's a good turning point? When should I drop? All these different topics we're going to try to start covering for the Kaleido users. So make sure to hit the like and subscribe. I think you're really going to enjoy it. I think as I've worked with a lot of roasters throughout my roasting journey, I've learned so much, and we're just wanting to share that so that you're getting the most out of your roaster and you're getting going as quickly as possible. We don't want you to struggle with, man, my roast still kind of sucks and it's a year later. Like, what am I doing wrong? And it might be something just very simple. So again, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, comment, join us on Kaleido Roasters USA Facebook. Fantastic community of Kaleido users, and it's a lot of fun. Have a good one.